a 25,000-member megachurch. A charismatic bishop who built an empire, then died suddenly, leaving behind rumors, lawsuits, and a mountain of unpaid debt. A 240-acre campus sitting half-used in the Georgia suburbs. And a congregation that didn't know if their church was going to survive the year, let alone the decade. That was Birth Missionary Baptist Church in the winter of 2018. So when a controversial, twice-divorced, hip-hop-friendly preacher from Baltimore named Jamal Bryant walked into that pulpit, a lot of people, inside and outside the church, assumed they were watching a slow-motion collapse. Some thought he was the wrong man for the job. Some thought New Birth was already dead and just didn't know it yet. Now it's the middle of 2026, and what's actually happened to New Birth isn't the story anybody predicted. Not the critics, not the skeptics, not even, probably, Bryant himself. Today we're breaking down what really happened. The debt, the land, the housing project that's turning church property into home ownership for thousands of families. The controversies that nearly blew up his marriage in public, and the empire he's building that stretches way beyond Sunday morning. Stay to the end, because the most recent chapter of this story is still being written right now, in real time, and it might be the boldest move New Birth has made yet. To understand what Jamal Bryant walked into, you have to understand what he was walking into the middle of. New Birth wasn't just any church. Under Bishop Eddie Long, it had grown into one of the most recognizable black megachurches in America, a sprawling campus in Stonecrest, Georgia, just outside Atlanta, with tens of thousands of members at its peak. But by the time Long passed away in January 2018, the institution behind the pulpit was in trouble. There were lawsuits. There were allegations that had followed Long for years. And underneath all of it, there was debt. The kind of debt that doesn't show up on a Sunday morning, but quietly determines whether an institution survives. For about 10 months, New Birth was essentially rudderless. A church that size doesn't run on vibes. It runs on payroll, on facilities costs, on a membership roll that was already shrinking as people drifted away, unsure what came next. Then, in November 2018, the announcement came. Jamal Bryant, who had spent 17 years building Empowerment Temple in Baltimore into a force of its own, was leaving that pulpit to take over New Birth. He said publicly that he felt God had directed the move, and by March 2019, he was formally installed as senior pastor. Not everyone was thrilled. Bryant came in with a well-documented personal history, 2 divorces, a very public past relationship with Shirlane McCrae before her marriage to Bill de Blasio, and a reputation as a preacher who blurred the line between pulpit and pop culture more than traditionalists were comfortable with. Critics inside black church circles openly questioned whether a man with that should be leading one of the largest congregations in the country. It became a genuine debate, not a fringe one, about who gets to stand in the pulpit and why. Bryant didn't dodge it. He leaned into being unconventional. And from day one, his pitch to the congregation wasn't "trust me because I'm perfect." It was closer to "judge me by what gets built." Here's the thing nobody tells you about running a megachurch. It is, whether anyone likes admitting it or not, a massive real estate and financial operation. New Birth sat on more than 240 acres. That's not a typo. 240 acres of land in one of the fastest growing counties in Georgia, most of it doing basically nothing for the church's bottom line. Bryant's first major strategic move wasn't a sermon series. It was looking at that acreage and asking a very simple, very unspiritual question. What is this land actually worth? And how do we make it work for us, instead of just sitting there? Over his first several years, that land became the engine for digging the church out of its financial hole. Development deals, partnerships, and restructuring efforts chipped away at the debt that had been hanging over the institution since before he even arrived. By 2020, the church was already publicly touting progress on eliminating specific categories of debt tied to the congregation, including medical debt relief initiatives for families in South DeKalb, a move that generated real local news coverage because it was such an unusual thing for a church to prioritize. This is the part that a lot of megachurch stories skip over, because it's not flashy, but it mattered enormously. A church that's still hemorrhaging money from a previous era can't build anything new. Bryant's team had to stabilize the foundation before anyone could talk about a vision for the future. And by most outside accounts, that's exactly what happened over his first few years. Not overnight, not without friction, but steadily. Now here's where the story gets genuinely wild, because what started as let's use this land to get out of debt eventually turned into one of the more ambitious projects to come out of any American church in recent memory. In the spring of 2026, New Birth announced New Birth Village, a plan to build more than 390 homes directly on church property. Using roughly 35 acres of debt-free land the church now controlled outright. This wasn't low-income subsidized housing in the traditional sense. It was specifically designed for what Bryant called the squeezed middle. Teachers, nurses, first-time buyers, public safety workers, seniors, and grandparents raising grandchildren. The people who make too much money to qualify for government housing assistance but not enough to compete in Atlanta's brutal housing market. The numbers behind why this mattered are stark. Black home ownership nationally had been sliding for years, dropping to roughly 44% by some measures, compared to over 70% for white households. Atlanta, despite being one of the strongest metros in the country for black home ownership, was still watching working families get priced out of the market they helped build. New Birth's answer was essentially, if the system won't build pathways to ownership fast enough, the church will use its own land to do it. Then, on Juneteenth weekend 2026, Bryant took it even further. During a Sunday service, he unveiled something called BLACKGROUND, a 6-part economic framework built around New Birth Village as its centerpiece, but expanding into education, civic engagement, and food security as connected pillars of the same mission. He and First Lady Dr. Karri Turner Bryant led the congregation in a literal groundbreaking ceremony on the property that day. The reception was staggering. Before a single foundation was poured, more than 3,000 families had already joined the waiting list for those 390 homes. And the project leaned hard into a specific philosophy, using black developers, black construction planners, and black-owned construction crews throughout, so the economic impact of building the homes stayed inside the community it was meant to serve, not just the eventual homeowners. Say what you want about megachurches and their finances, and plenty of people do. But turning church land into a housing pipeline for thousands of families is not a small pivot. It's a complete reimagining of what a congregation's physical footprint is even for. Housing wasn't the only front. Long before New Birth Village broke ground, Bryant had already built out the King's Table, a food security program that became one of the most consistent parts of the church's identity. What started as pandemic-era emergency response turned into a standing institution. Regular, bi-weekly distributions of groceries and fresh produce that, over its lifetime, has reportedly served more than 1.4 million individuals. That's not a marketing number pulled from a press release designed to sound big. That's the scale of an operation running food logistics like a small nonprofit distribution network out of a church parking lot every couple of weeks for years. Alongside King's Table, the church built out scholarship programs that have put roughly $4 million into the hands of more than 500 students over 5 years, and launched retail initiatives like the Bullseye Black Market, which brought together hundreds of black-owned vendors across multiple shopping weekends, giving small business owners a platform and a customer base they might never have accessed otherwise. And then there's the part of Bryant's ministry that doesn't get talked about enough, the mental health piece. New Birth introduced regular group therapy-style Bible studies, a hybrid format blending spiritual teaching with actual psychological wellness conversation, acknowledging something a lot of black churches historically danced around, that faith and therapy aren't opposites, and a congregation carrying generational trauma needs both. Combine all of that with a full-blown national activism presence, Bryant regularly stands alongside civil rights figures like Al Sharpton and attorney Ben Crump on high-profile cases involving violence against black Americans, and you start to see the actual shape of what New Birth became under him. It stopped being just a Sunday morning operation and turned into something closer to a full-service community infrastructure, food, housing, education, mental health, and activism, all running through one institution. Now let's talk about the part of this story that had absolutely nothing to do with housing policy and everything to do with the internet doing what the internet does best. In December 2025, First Lady Dr. Karri Turner Bryant wore a black gown with nude mesh lining to the UNCSF Atlanta Mayor's Masked Ball, a formal, secular fundraising event, not a church service. photos hit social media, and within hours, a genuine firestorm broke out over whether the dress was too revealing for a pastor's wife. This wasn't just internet chatter. It escalated into something much bigger when a prominent bishop from another denomination used his own pulpit to publicly and crudely condemn Turner Bryant's appearance, sparking outrage of its own for how degrading the language was. The moment turned into a much larger conversation across Black church culture about modesty, double standards, and who actually gets to decide what a first lady is allowed to wear. Bryant didn't stay quiet. On New Year's Eve, from his own pulpit, he addressed the entire controversy head-on, defending his wife directly, making clear he'd chosen and approved the dress himself, and framing the backlash as a distraction from the actual issues the church should be focused on: unemployment, healthcare access, education. He pointed out that on that very same night, over 100 people had been saved and 1,000 kids were active in the youth program, essentially asking why a dress was getting more attention than that. It became one of the more talked-about moments to come out of any Black church in early 2026, and it revealed something real about how Bryant runs New Birth. He doesn't play defense quietly. When controversy hits, he takes it straight to the pulpit and turns it into a teaching moment, whether the audience wants that moment or not. The dress controversy wasn't the only friction point. Twice in January 2026 alone, New Birth found itself dealing with disruptive incidents actually happening inside the building during services. In one case, a man walked in and launched into a screaming rant directed at Bryant, and it reportedly took security nearly 5 minutes to intervene. A delay that rattled members enough that they publicly called for tighter security at the front entrance. In a separate incident that same month, an unidentified preacher interrupted a gathering entirely, condemning the church, its leadership, and its members, and invoking the memory of Eddie Long while attacking Bryant directly. New Birth's leadership responded the way most large institutions do when public safety becomes a headline, reaffirming that member and staff safety was the top priority and that they were continually reassessing security protocols alongside law enforcement. These moments matter for the full picture because they show that Bryant's version of New Birth exists in a much more exposed, much more online, much more contested space than the church did in earlier eras. Every sermon, every outfit, every security lapse becomes content, gets clipped, gets debated by millions of people who've never set foot in Stonecrest, Georgia. That's simply the environment a high-profile pastor operates in now, and it comes with real friction that earlier generations of church leadership never had to manage in real time. So, after all of that, what's the honest answer to the question in the title? What really happened to New Birth after Jamal Bryant took the reins? The church didn't shrink. It didn't collapse under debt. It didn't quietly fade the way a lot of observers expected back in 2018 and 2019. Instead, New Birth built one of the more ambitious economic development projects to come out of any American congregation in the past decade. Cleared meaningful chunks of historical debt, fed well over 1 million people through an ongoing food program, funded millions in scholarships, and is now in the process of turning nearly 36 acres of formerly idle land into an actual neighborhood that thousands of families are already lined up to move into. At the same time, it became a magnet for controversy, some of it about substance, like questions over Bryant's own personal history and fitness for leadership when he first arrived, and some of it about optics, like a single dress at a gala that somehow became a national referendum on modesty and gender expectations inside the Black church. It's also had to grapple with the uncomfortable reality that its own high profile makes it a target, literally, in the form of people walking into services looking to disrupt them. Bryant's church today isn't a quiet institution, and it was never going to be one. What it has become is something closer to a hybrid, part traditional Baptist congregation, part economic development corporation, part media platform, and part lightning rod. Whether you think that's the right model for what a 21st century Black church should be, or whether you think it strays too far from the pulpit's original purpose, the results on paper are hard to argue with. A debt-crippled institution that within roughly 7 years became one that's putting families into homes. The BLACKGROUND framework Bryant unveiled in June 2026 makes clear this isn't slowing down. Housing is described as just the opening move, with education, civic engagement, and food security explicitly built in as the next phases of the same long-term plan. He's framed the timing of all of it as deliberate, building generational wealth infrastructure now. while the political and economic window is open, rather than waiting on institutions outside the church to move first. So no, Jamal Bryant didn't run New Birth into the ground the way some of his early critics predicted. And he didn't quietly maintain what Eddie Long left behind either. He rebuilt the financial foundation, then used it to launch a housing initiative that's already put thousands of families on a waiting list before a single home was finished, while simultaneously becoming one of the most talked about and occasionally most controversial pastors in the country. Whatever you think about the dress, the disruptions, or the debates over his own past, one thing is hard to dispute. The version of New Birth operating today looks almost nothing like the church that was left behind in January 2018. And if BLACKGROUND plays out the way Bryant has laid it out, this might only be the early chapters of a much bigger story. What do you think? Is this the future of what a megachurch should be? Or has New Birth strayed too far from what a church is supposed to do? Drop your take in the comments, and if you want more breakdowns like this on the biggest names shaping Black church culture right now, hit subscribe, because this story is still being written.